we're going to do is our talks, I mean, although we've constructed them separately, they're sort of connected in a kind of general theme, in that I'm going to be talking a little bit more about sort of general ideas to do with teaching philosophy within psychiatry. And then Ivan and Benjamin are going to kind of take it into action and have a sort of dialogue and exchange, hopefully a kind of living example. So I'm going to share my screen right now. Hopefully, let's get that up. And slideshow. Okay, now can everyone see that? Is that okay? Great. Okay, so to start, so yeah, I'm often curious when I chat to psychiatry trainees and other people, psychiatrists, about what makes them interested in philosophy and the connection between philosophy and psychiatry. And a lot of the time, the answer that I get back from them is actually people say to me, well, it was my interest in philosophy that got me to choose psychiatry. I chose it as a specialism, or even, I went into it as a career because of my interests in philosophy. And so this makes me think that, in a way, it should be an easy job as a philosopher of medicine. Bringing it into psychiatry should be an easy job. We should have a captive audience because there's already this interest embedded in people. But then, thinking it through, I realized that it's also not quite that simple. And we're going to just talk through some of those issues today. So, yeah, as I say, there seems in a way that there's an intrinsic connection between philosophy and psychiatry. And, we can think of some of the examples. So, for example, I mean, if we think about contemporary psychopathology, it has its roots in phenomenology, and phenomenology has been interconnected with it throughout its development. If we think about issues about mental health ethics and law, the questions of surrounding autonomy, I mean, philosophy is deeply embedded in that. The connection between psychotherapy, psychotherapeutic theories and philosophy, and of course the question of the endless talks about what constitutes mental illness, what is a mental health condition. Those types of questions are absolutely embedded. So it seems like there is an intrinsic connection. So then it makes me think, well, if philosophy, if it's intrinsic to psychiatry and it isn't just a sort of interesting add-on, does it imply that philosophy as a discipline is going to be live when we teach it in psychiatry? And I should explain what I mean by being live. There may be a slight paradox. If it's already embedded, if the questions are already there, is it actually going to be harder work in a way to bring philosophy into psychiatry than to other areas of medicine? Because the connection's there. How can we make this connection still remain relevant? How can we make it remain interesting for our students? So, thinking about what might be the philosophy USP, is it the USP or is it the problem? I remember early on in this series, someone was talking about the question of, what it means to bring philosophy into medical education. And, this idea that philosophy, the central element of philosophy, is that it teaches us, it gives us the framework, the methods, how to question our assumptions. And so, that's its use. That's the way that it's going to be brought into medicine. And I think, that's definitely a very attractive viewpoint, but it does actually lead, it also seems to lead to a series of questions. We might think, yeah, okay, let's take that. That's great. And that's the way that it's going to be live. But, I've been thinking it through, and I'm not so sure that it's as simple as that. So I'm going to start with a quote from Jaspers. The most profound distinction in psychic life seems to be that between what is meaningful and allows empathy and what in its particular way is ununderstandable, mad in the literal sense, in schizophrenic psychic life. So Jaspers, at the very beginning of modern psychopathology, came up with this idea of the ununderstandable, the ununderstandable, but that's probably, especially given that I've got German co-hosts, I probably shouldn't have even tried to attempt to say that in German, but it sounds much better in German. Jaspers actually created the word, and he created the word to convey this idea that there are elements of the experience of mental illness that are so detached from ordinary experience that actually we can't reach understanding. He had this idea that understanding is built on finding connections between our own experiences and the experiences of the people with mental illness. We find some common ground, and that allows us a sort of empathy, a kind of intersubjectivity that allows us a way in, a way of understanding. But he said that when it comes to things like psychosis, actually this isn't possible. So already we've got this deep, this deep question here in this concept of the ununderstandable. And so what I've said is really, if this is already built in, do we and so that's one example. And then taking things forward to sort of the present day, and what's happened to phenomenology in psychiatry. So there is this idea that phenomenology was such a fundamental part of forming contemporary psychopathology, the ideas within it and the practice. But actually, well, what's happened is that what started off as the central idea that we need to look in great depth at the experience of the individual to really understand what's happening, to really understand the nature of these conditions. Well, gradually over time, sort of people have come together and spotted commonalities, and over time this has become more and more the case, and it's got to a point where actually, well, sort of ends up at the kind of DSM end of things, where you have very, very sort of strict definitions of particular disorders and distinct symptomatic sort of indicators and this kind of thing. And so, I mean, there's this great article I put the reference at the end by Nancy Andreasen, where she talks about sort of the DSM almost as the death of phenomenology, that phenomenology has kind of been the victim of its own success. And so what we have here is a sort of living example of where something that was built on the idea of questioning and looking with curiosity into individual experiences has been so sort of successful over the years that it's actually led to its own demise. And then, if we retain the idea of questioning, the problem is, also, I mean, if you're a philosopher, I'm sure you've encountered this, that people will say, well, it's all very well showing me that, you show me that this doesn't work and that doesn't work, but, you've left me none the wiser. And I've got this quote from Plato's Apology. So Socrates says, "I'm better off than he is, for he knows nothing and thinks that he knows. I neither know nor think that I know." And people famously, people always associate Socrates with this idea that he's the wisest man because all he knows is that he knows nothing. And that's the sort of quote really that it's the idea is based upon. And this takes us to the idea that actually, what we're going to end up with, we use philosophy, we question the assumptions, we see the inherent flaws, the difficulties, but we end up in a state of what the ancients referred to as aporia, this state of literally being at a loss, where our questioning has led us to a point where we have no firm answers anymore. And well, the obvious difficulty is that if you're a clinician, you do need some answers. You can't, you've got to treat people, and you can't just sort of stand there saying, well, we could see it this way, we could see it that way. You need to make decisions, and you need to have some firm knowledge. And so that could be another difficulty. So back to the question, how can we teach philosophy within psychiatry in a way that shows that it contributes something relevant and interesting? And I've said, can we avoid philosophical hubris? So I think that one thing that philosophers had a tendency to do is they have a tendency to come to other areas thinking, well, you know, I'm bringing my philosophical frameworks, I'm enriching this particular discipline by bringing philosophy to this discipline, and the sort of the techniques, the knowledge that I bring is going to help people to understand their own discipline better. And now, you know, you can start to understand why philosophers are sometimes unpopular. And I think that this is something, we have to move away from this attitude. And, you know, if we're going to successfully bring philosophy into psychiatry, into other elements of medical education, we need to move away from that kind of idea of a one-way relationship. So what I'm talking about here really is the idea of interdisciplinarity, but true interdisciplinarity. The idea that you have a reciprocal relationship, whether it be in research or in teaching, you have a reciprocal relationship between the disciplines that are working together, that they work together, they embrace each other's ideas and approaches, and they're both or all, if there's more than two, enriched through that process of reciprocity. And so I think I tried to create some ideas about how I would, you know, how we can go about this. I think one thing is rigor. So, you know, if your work is interdisciplinary, then what you need to have is you need to be able to be rigorous to the standards of rigor of each discipline that you're working with. It's not enough to be rigorous in an individual discipline. If you're going to have meaningful engagement with another discipline, you need to achieve rigor in that discipline too, to be, if it's going to be live, if it's going to be interesting and relevant. So I think that an important thing is that actually, well, it might seem obvious, but it's not always obvious to everyone, is actually, you know, you need to know the subject. You need to, if you're going to bring philosophy into psychiatry, into other branches of medicine, you need to know things about the subject. You need to learn the subject yourself. Obviously, you need as well to know your limitations. I mean, the first thing I do when I'm lecturing to psychiatry trainees is I admit that I'm not a clinician. I'm a philosopher. You know, I've done my best to learn a lot about psychiatry, but obviously I've never stood in a clinician's, you know, shoes. I've never been making those decisions or in that position. And also I think it's very important to choose relevant examples, to choose examples which are going to appeal to students, which people are going to find interesting and relevant to the things that they practice. Another thing as well, I think that part of interdisciplinary teaching is actually, and I didn't realize this when I first started out, is to recognize that there are pedagogical differences in the sort of culture, the culture of education. And what I mean by this, I think, is when I first started teaching philosophy to medics, to psychiatrists, I found that actually I'd sort of ask, you know, throw in a question, what does anyone think about this idea? And I'd be met by silence, and I'd be very surprised, because I think, well, you know, this isn't, you know, what's happening? Is it me? I'm used to talking to people and people being quite interactive, and I sort of think, well, you know, what's going on? And then after a while, I talked to some people, to some medics, and what they said is actually, you know, the style of education that they've been used to is very, very different as part of medical training, and even as they move into the specialist training for psychiatry, it's very much about sort of, you know, imbibing large amounts of knowledge. And if you're going to ask a question in a lecture, actually, it's probably going to be a question about clarification of a particular thing, rather than this idea that you might question something or, you know, try and redefine something. So it was important to recognize that. And it's also important, I think, to recognize that there are different base levels of interest. As I say, there are some psychiatrists I've met who are absolutely fascinated by philosophy. And, you know, I remember one feedback form that just, all that was written was "more philosophy in lectures, please," triple exclamation mark, which, you know, was lovely to see. But I suppose being realistic, you know, not everybody is going to feel like that. There's going to be some people who are there who hear the word philosophy and think, oh, ooh, what's going on now? So you have to cater and realize that there are going to be different base levels of interest, different base levels of knowledge, and somehow make things work for everybody along that spectrum. And I think also that actually one needs perhaps almost to work harder to build an interactive engagement, to draw people. If our sort of USP is questioning, we need to work harder to draw people into that process, to make them part of that process and really engage them. And then finally, reciprocity once again. So this is the question: what does psychiatry bring to philosophy? I think, you know, it's important that as philosophers that we recognize it's not just that we're bringing something to medicine, but actually we're getting so much from it, and we need to, you know, we need to realize that ourselves, and we need also to, I think, to bring it to our students, whether they be in a philosophical or a medical background, to show that that, you know, thinking. As philosophers, we like to come up with examples. We often come up with hypothetical examples. But here in medicine and in psychiatry in particular, we have this incredibly rich arena of examples to look at, to consider, that can really, you know, can really enrich our understanding of so many different things in every field of philosophy. I think every field of philosophy can be enriched in this way, and I think it's important that we recognize that and somehow try to draw that in. And with that in mind, I am going to just come on to a little bit of an example to try and show the sort of thing that I'm talking about. So once again, back to Plato, I'm afraid. I said, are our experiences and perceptions real? An ancient and modern debate. So this is, in Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, he's having a conversation with this young man, Theaetetus, and Socrates was questioning him and saying, you know, Theaetetus, what's knowledge? What is knowledge? What do you think knowledge is? And one of the answers that Theaetetus comes up with, one of the first answers, is this idea that perception is knowledge. And what Socrates does is he links it to the idea of the pre-Socratic Protagoras, who's known very much associated with this phrase that man is the measure. And what he says is, you know, it's not a bad description of knowledge you've given, but one which Protagoras also used to give, only he said the same thing in a different way. For he says somewhere that man is the measure of all things, of the existence of the things that are, and the non-existence of the things that are not. And so he draws that together, this idea that if you think that knowledge, if you think that perception is knowledge, and I always see this sort of as the beginning of the sort of phenomenology debate. If you think that knowledge is perception, if you really think that man is the measure, that knowledge and reality lies in things as the individual experiences them, then what happens as the dialogue goes on is that Socrates tries to show there's consequences, you know, that are difficult. And it's always really fascinated me that the thing that he uses as his paradigm refutation of this point is the idea of madness. And he says, so he comes to Theaetetus, he considers the idea and then says, let us then not neglect a point in which it's defective. The defects found in connection with dreams and diseases, including insanity and everything else that's said to cause illusions of sight and hearing and the other senses. For, of course, you know that in all these, the doctrine we were just presenting seems admittedly to be refuted, because in them we certainly have false perceptions, and it's by no means true that everything is to each man what appears to him. On the contrary, nothing is which appears. So that sort of foundational principle that if someone is experiencing severe mental illness, if they're having delusions, if they're having sort of distorted thoughts or beliefs, then that is proof that, you know, it's almost the way to disprove phenomenology. And let's see how this relates to things. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to bring it into, we had a study, and one element of the study was a survey, was about, it was all about advanced directives, and one element was asking service users with bipolar, a large number of service users with bipolar, about what they thought about these things, self-binding directives. So the idea that you would say in advance, you know in advance that you're going to, when you're very unwell, you won't want to have treatment, but you also know that that's going to be harmful to you. So what you could do is you could write a document that says in advance, look, if I'm refusing treatment, I want to be effectively, bound to treatment. They're also called Ulysses clauses. And we asked people, what do you think of the idea? And do you endorse it? Do you reject it? And if so, why? And so this was the answer. Quite a lot of people, a lot of respondents endorsed it very, very strongly. And the reason that they gave, which was so interesting, wasn't actually about the harms that could arise, but it was because of what they presented in very many different ways, of this idea that their thinking is distorted. Their thinking is distorted when they're severely unwell. It's this big sort of shift to a very different type of thought process, which is so fundamentally different that they need to have treatment to restore them to their well and valid thought processes. And this is an example. So when you're manic, you don't see things as they really are. You don't always know you're ill or how ill you are. You can get paranoid. You might be really scared, or the opposite, and think you're in heaven or something like that. And then at the end, as far as medication's concerned, I've no problem with a doctor being able to control what I take when I'm really ill, as they've always brought me back in the past. So like this would, on the one hand, this really seems to sort of support this Plato idea. And if you come to the question, what do you do if someone is refusing treatment for mania? This is going to be a common experience for psychiatrists. Well, these views seem to back up this idea that, well, actually that refusal, that's the product of distorted thinking, and I should be treating this person, I should be trying to address that problem. And it almost, it seems to almost prove the point that Plato's made, that knowledge is not perception, experience is not reality. So, but then if we look more closely, what we see is, in the middle, they say, plus the idea of going to a psychiatric hospital is terrifying to anybody, as is lack of control. So what they're saying there, so the question, before imposing involuntary treatment, of course, there's this question, does the minimization of risk balance out the taking away of control and the trauma of experiencing involuntary confinement and treatment? So even for a person who's endorsing this idea, they still acknowledge that at the time, that element, how it feels to be treated involuntarily, how it feels to be out of control, have things taken out of your control, is going to feel terrifying. That's real. That is a real experience. That's a valid experience. So even there, we've got the question. And then just to finish up, we move on to, this is now one of the service users who rejected the idea of this self-binding directive. And what they said is, I'm wary of being hospitalized when I'm manic because I don't feel that this is a destructive part of my illness. In fact, I enjoy it. I'm happy, productive, and move my life on in important ways which I can't do in hospital. However, I'm well aware that psychiatric professionals all see mania as very destructive, even though my most destructive behavior is by far when I'm severely depressed. So I assumed that a psychiatrist would probably attempt to get me to agree to hospitalization or treatment for manic episodes, as well as depressive, which I don't want, but couldn't convince a psychiatrist of. So we can now see that things aren't quite as straightforward as they may have seemed. And we come back to this question, what do you do if someone's refusing treatment for mania? Well, clearly, in the eyes of this person, even when they're well, what they say is that mania is a really valuable part. They see mania, the experience of mania as a really valuable part of their life that really brings them positive things. And that actually they wouldn't want, even when they're well, they would not want that to be treated. They wouldn't want to miss that experience. And so that almost seems to be tending towards this idea of perception of knowledge is knowledge and reality. And it leads us to this, the question, so, is mania destructive? We're taught in the DSM, look for the signs of mania. This is the person with mania. These are the treatments, whatever, and see the damage that it can often result in. But is it always destructive? Can we define it as destructive? And then coming back once again to this question, is it right to impose involuntary treatment on someone experiencing mania? Well, the first person, you'd almost say, well, yeah, they themselves really want it. Whereas this person, is saying, actually, no. As psychiatrists, you can see it and you think that, yes, but for me, it's valuable. And so we begin to see that actually, these things are very individualized. These things depend a lot on individual values, the cost-benefit analysis that individuals make about these experiences. And in a way, this leaves us, it leaves us in what we might see as aporia, this state of being at a loss. Where do we go from here? Or on the other hand, we may feel that it leaves us with a greater understanding and of the idea that actually these things are the notions of risk, notions of what's destructive in an illness can be very individualized, and that's something that we need to consider when we're dealing with conditions like this. And at that point, on that question, is this constructive aporia? Can aporia be constructive? I'll hand over to Ivan and Benjamin.
Thank you so much, Tania. That was really, really interesting. So I'll just introduce Ivan.